10 Blind Delusions About the Benefits of War by Johannes Bartschi. First delusion: war is the way to peace.
Progress knows the rhythm of work and rest, hunger and satiation, success and failure. Mistakes also serve progress, but only when the individual gains knowledge from them and puts it into practice. War and peace are never comparable, vitally necessary rhythms. War basically destroys everything. The life of millions of people, with which it is equivalent to murder, just as when a tourist is killed somewhere out of greed for money. War leaves a multitude of mutilated people in its wake, and with the present-day warfare, also millions of people who will waste away from radiation injuries and give birth to children with deformities for many generations to come. All these things will not only be directly involved in unleashing the Third World War, but will also anger those of us who did too little to prevent it. Furthermore, anger and desires for revenge remain after war and are passed on from generation to generation. Hatred is often fomented anew for the purpose of vengeance. Whoever travelled through France and Great Britain in the decades following World War II could not help but to experience how the hatred that arose in the war was unleashed on the young Germans who were victims of the war themselves. Not only the Nazis were found to be guilty, but rightly so all those who fell prey to the election propaganda and who allowed their felonious government to do as it pleased for years. Out of respect for the victims of the war, many of the French and English refused to accommodate German guests, and some of them still abide by this up to this day. After that kind of experience, all sensibly thinking Germans today are firmly against the Third World War. They say to themselves, in the First World War, grandfather served the Kaiser, and in the Second World War, father served the Führer, but I have shown my children a better way. Every single European citizen, both male and female, cannot get around doing a whole lot more, so that their governments do not fall for the wishes of warmongering nations and their own people do not become victims against their will. More than any other country, Switzerland, with its still existing democratic rights of co-determination, would have many possibilities, indeed the greatest chance worldwide, to contribute to an honest solution. The upcoming vote on the 18th of May 2003 on the new NATO-oriented military law would set a signal for the entire world. It is perhaps a last opportunity to emphasize that the people, despite the questionable UN vote, know that they can do more for the world with neutrality than with intervention in foreign quarrels. One should also bear in mind that the ceasefire following a war is by no means equivalent to peace. It is always the beginning of a peaceless period and carries the seeds of the next war within it. Only when endeavours for true peace have been made over generations can something new finally grow.
Second delusion: war will make us rich.
Every nation that plunders the resources of its own soil for decades, overbuilds its land with too many houses, streets and industrial plants, and out of feigned humanity, which is ultimately might politics and greed for profit, summons more people into its land than it can nourish from its own soil, begins to rob other nations. For a while the exploitation is disguised each time by offering a trade deal that is profitable for both sides to a developing country. Field labourers in third world countries are taken in by the fact that they are now able to drink Coca-Cola whenever they please and may take part in international progress through daily television consumption. They are temporarily blind to the fact that they not only lose their land and their healthy work, but also forfeit the psychic values which could lead to their own evolution. The aggressor nation, however, that abandons itself to waste, will run into exorbitant debt over time despite trade advantages. A country that is bankrupt can no longer be governed, and the heads of state hope they can save themselves with a war. Even if a victory were possible, only a heap of fragments would be left on both sides. For as long as wastefulness continues to be passed off as pleasant economic growth, immense resources on other continents are also useless. A good example of this is Great Britain. This country was a heroic victor after the Second World War. To this day, however, it has never regained the prosperity it once enjoyed before the war, because it has never been able to recover from the burden of war debts. To sum things up, every single person must be conscious that war only pays off for weapon pushers, rip-off merchants and hidden profiteers. It is the people, however, who shoulder all the heavy burdens for generations to come. The working population of an aggressor state usually becomes impoverished within a short period of time, but almost always for a long period of time.
Third delusion, war contributes to the recovery of a nation.
As luck would have it, such claims of politicians and high-ranking officers are comparable to the proverbial wooden hammer method in surgery. The skull of the patient is smashed to free him prophylactically from his appendix. Health is a great good that must be worked for. All the more care must be taken when dealing with sick people. Whoever considers a people sick and wants to heal with an aggressive war should be watched with eagle eyes. On the contrary, a people is only strong when each person makes sure that he or she has a healthy diet, meaningful work, an intact family and enough living space. These important endeavours come from the knowledge of creation's laws. In contrast to this, any people will grow sick sooner or later, when the primary concern of a great number of its populace is to acquire all the advantages that will bring it as much financial wealth as possible and only require little work of itself. Too many irresponsible, self-indulgent and lazy people in a community are always warmongering forces. Whoever is striving to have a healthy people must start with this problem.
Fourth delusion, war creates heroes.
Ever since antiquity, attempts have been made to stylistically elevate aggressive warriors to heroes. In reality, the returned soldiers, in contrast to the highest-ranking officers, were usually looked down upon in their villages and towns. As we know from the Swiss mercenary corps, the best young men often left their homes and returned brutalized, crippled and sick years or decades later. Just think for a moment. What mother or child or even what wife is delighted when an official mass murderer comes back into the family? The talk of heroism is mockery and scorn when high-ranking officers in bulletproof containers work out operational orders far away from the scene of battle, and the Air Corps have to release their neurotoxins, their epidemic bombs and their nuclear shells from high overhead, and then fly away as fast as possible. The reports of veterans who returned from the Vietnam War and the Gulf War are shocking. We hear that very many, and some even say nearly all, who released bombs and blind shells took their own lives sooner or later. Nearly all who returned from the Gulf War were contaminated and brain damaged. Very many of them are now among the hushed-up victims of war. Some tell of the horrible dreams that have haunted them night after night since then, and drive them almost crazy. A report on the radio by Suzanne Brunner and one in Fax, Zurich, March of 2003, show how US soldiers are trained for war. A teacher and major of this elite training program was quoted as saying, "Only he or she who feels the desire to serve America to the death will endure this rigid training." It is known that aggressor nations today not only prepare their warriors for the horribly aggressive acts of war with crime films and brutal videos, but also conduct their own hardening courses for this in military academies. Bear in mind that only good students are chosen for the military academy, who most likely would not volunteer for such an adverse military operation without such hard ideological training.
Fifth delusion, war leads to justice.
The current war rhetoric sounds no different than it did in earlier times. It is hammered into the heads of the electorate that it would be a charitable act for the people attacked if they were freed from their tyrants. Aggressors have always labelled their intentions as a just war. But those who genuinely strive for justice will not destroy the joy of achievement, which leads to general prosperity, and will therefore not even consider war. Warmongers, however, are disturbed in their sense of justice and try to manipulate the people in such a way that they let their government do as it pleases, and even talk themselves into believing that it knows what is right.
Sixth delusion. War serves to propagate the true religion.
According to Karl Jaspers, a philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century, and many other distinguished writers, religions of divine revelation more or less paralyze thinking. All the illogical claims of believers come from them, such as the claim that they alone possess the true religion and that it may be imposed on all other human beings. Religious compulsion is always power politics, and before long, the first step is taken towards a religious war. Among the hypocritical inhabitants of the aggressor state, the hope of weakening the feared religion of their rival may also resonate in their secret desires. Whoever really thinks that a war can make a religion disappear is indeed blinded intellectually. War causes the exact opposite of this desire. Islam, which is under attack today, will by no means be weakened. At no other time do believers crowd into their mosques, donate their money and honor their priests more than during times of war. Fanatics shoot up like mushrooms. In times of distress, fundamentalism gains the upper hand. In the aggressor countries, Christian churches of all confessions will also fill temporarily. In Switzerland, for example, we are now experiencing that the 2 female members of the Federal Council are even attending church services these days and are upheld as good examples for this by the press. A serious consequence of the Iraq war in the religious realm will be that millions of refugees will pour into Europe and especially Switzerland. In many host countries, Islam will soon be the majority religion, whereupon armed conflicts will also develop there. The war in Iraq will inevitably be followed by numerous other wars. It was reported on the radio that a member of the Iraqi government has already called upon Iraqis from all over the world to avenge themselves with well-organized terror attacks for the aggressions of the invaders. This occurred as a result of an Islamic conference, in which an attempt was made to clarify whether the instruction of the Quran that every believer has the duty to exterminate non-believers with the sword is still relevant today. Only a single weak voice was for a milder form of implementing this rule, and all representatives of state Islamic positions were unyielding. This is not meant to be defamatory, all the more since the felonies of Christianity, such as those compiled in the 5-volume work of Deshna, are also no glorious chapter, but is meant to show just how much the present-day warmongers are playing with the fire of an endless war.
Seventh delusion. War will decimate an unpopular race.
Whoever is so racist in thinking that he or she nurtures in him or her the hope of exterminating a race is doubtlessly also indulging here in an unconscious delusion. In a 1991 plebiscite, Switzerland was forced, largely under the pressure of today's aggressor nation and the church, to accept a racial law that not only incites racial conflicts, but is also used to suppress free opinions, even if they have nothing to do with racial issues. From that time on, every independent-thinking Swiss citizen can come into conflict with this law. Only the Swiss people may be insulted, humiliated, scorned, and driven into legal incapacitation. Nearly every week in this country, our young Swiss soldiers are ridiculed by foreigners, and citizens or the police are often spat upon for no reason, as I already had to experience myself. If an assaulted Swiss citizen loses his or her temper and defends himself or herself against the troublemaker, he or she is hit hard by the racial law, whereas the assailant goes unpunished, as in the case of the murderer of the teacher, Spirig. In the aggressor states that demanded the racial law from us because we allegedly would only then be worthy of the Charter of Human Rights, racial hatred is more rampant than at the time of official slavery. It may even be fomented by the government itself for the purpose of a planned war. Here again, the calculation of the aggressor states does not work out. As everyone knows, a shortage of food and a lack of living space, as well as frequently inadequate medical care, slowed down the population explosion. However, if these countries sprawl out over Europe with a stream of refugees, who are cared for there as well as they are right now in Switzerland, the population growth in Europe will increase uncontrollably. Every Iraqi family in Central Europe will burden the world with an average of 5 or more children as soon as the parents have become somewhat established.
Eighth delusion. War will alleviate the problem of overpopulation.
Based on incorrectly understood doctrines of faith, hardly anyone dares to talk about overpopulation in Christian countries. Too prevalent are the Christian views there that having children uncontrollably is a human right, and that humanity is displayed first and foremost by honouring a great number of children. However, this is precisely the area where the human being is fundamentally different from an animal. The reproductive behaviour of an animal is controlled by instinct, whereas the human being has to develop the wisdom necessary to make right decisions himself or herself. It is a fact that the population explosion can never be blamed on the founder of Christianity, but doubtlessly on those who gradually rewrote his texts. A large part of the unsolved conflicts also involves the fact that the human being, in his or her freedom and responsibility, must first of all bring the number of children on earth into harmony with nature. In doing so, it must be heeded that the human being was born to accomplish greater tasks than an animal, and therefore needs an appropriately large realm, in which he or she can move about in order to develop his or her talents. According to careful calculations, only about 500 million people should be living on this planet, with which an optimal development would be possible. This would also be the appropriate number for a harmonious coexistence with animals and plants. All people suffer from the overpopulation, even if they are unconscious of the source of their uneasiness. As a consequence of the 16-fold overpopulation 2017, secret hopes emerge in many people that a war could significantly contribute to decimating humanity in the fastest possible way. However, it is an abominable and unfitting suggestion to attain fewer people through murder and manslaughter. The ones killed would be replaced almost overnight through the production of a double number of offspring. After the Balkan War, we all know that an official request was made to all Croatian women to compensate for the loss of their people with as many births as possible. Only the knowledge of the laws of nature and the creation, which enable our life to unfold as it should, can lead to a better regulation here on Earth. The harmonization of the population figure must be supported by the insight of the majority of a people, combined, of course, with appropriate state ordinances. Only on this basis will humanity achieve success. Bear in mind that the extinguished human lives are only departed from life for this incarnation. Their uncontrolled lifestyle, which also includes their lack of consciousness about childbearing, remains stored on this earth. This lack of consciousness is again immediately assimilated by the newborn children and continued in their new life. War, therefore, achieves absolutely nothing for a balanced population figure.
Ninth delusion. God's judgment over human beings is a part of providence.
Among Christians, there is a far greater number than we think, who do nothing but twiddle their thumbs, because they believe the prophecies of the Bible are being fulfilled, and that God is avenging himself on non-believers. A totally devastating world war is therefore a liberation for these believers. Many of them also cling to the heavenward departure of the Christian community described in 2 letters by Paul, in which the so-called bride of Christ is supposed to be carried away. Whoever thinks like this combines his or her yearning for a better world with this expectation and embraces an unrealistic hope for liberation. In countries with very many fundamentalist-oriented churches, like in the USA and Switzerland, this belief is quite effective. It is often combined with esoteric convictions and with the assumption that extraterrestrial spaceships, navigated by Jesus Christ, will gather his believers and take them to a planet not yet destroyed. Indeed, There are enough reports about the early ages of our humanity, which involve large spaceships, and after thousands of years, the time will come when we, the human being of Earth, will also be able to undertake interstellar voyages. But those who let their talents waste away in passive belief, life after life, will definitely not be among the chosen ones to tackle the tough pioneer voyages into the expanses of the universe. On the contrary, it will be authorities in space travel, in peaceful coexistence, and in recognition of the truth who will set out on the great expeditions. Normally, new settlements on other stars only afford hard living conditions for thousands of years. Life can be unimaginably hard, as we know from the first settlers in South America. Therefore, it will definitely be worthwhile to protect our beautiful planet from a devastating war.
10th delusion, war will bring the end of all things.
It is typical for aggressor states that many within the population have grown weary of life. Countless numbers are sick because of their false nutrition and lack of movement. A culture with a lack of relations and no orientation leads to diseases in the realm of consciousness. Suicide rates and felonies grow more numerous each year. The wish, not to have to kill oneself but to be killed at one blow with others during a Third World War, has seized older many. In this way, they hope they can disappear from life forever. This erroneous hope is doubtless the worst self-deception, since neither suicide nor death in war puts an end to human life. According to the laws of logic, neither anything material, and by no means anything spiritual, simply disappears without a trace. Everything remains in existence and must continue to develop. Whatever we have evaded in this life will also still have to be processed. But if the blue planet Earth becomes a horrible place to live because of war toxins and nuclear radiation, it will save no human being from having to make do here with what he himself, she herself destroyed.
Conclusion.
At the moment, war scientists are working on nuclear bombs, whose fallout is no longer supposed to have such long half-life periods of hundreds or thousands of years. But at the present time, the arsenals are overfilled with 100-fold overkill capacity. It has become known that for Russia, the cost of the urgent disposal of old weapons is too high for this country to even be able to start such a task. As for the USA, whose great indebtedness is held as secret as possible, we know little about the storage places, and even less about the number of weapons they have. This country will also be faced with the problem of how to transform and dispose of this harmful material. For this reason, the notion that the aggressors could dispose of their materials over the states of the Middle East, or test new partially even more horrible weapons there, has become a horror vision. We are constantly flooded with so many reports on the irresponsibility of governments toward the health of the human beings and the environment, that a coming war will have to be prevented with all means by people who are more responsible. We shudder at the indifference of many talented contemporaries who do little, although it is relatively easy to reach members of the government and the press with letters. An exchange of material among fellow workers and family members also raises our consciousness to a higher level. Our governments mustn't be permitted, in their materialistic mentality and unnecessary anxiety, to betray their peoples instead of fulfilling the duty they were elected for by the citizens and taxpayers. Christianity succeeded in the first few centuries in removing from the biblical scriptures, little by little, the self-evident original Christian truth that life does not end after death and will actually continue on the same planet. Everything was done to restrict believers to the belief in a single earthly life. This short-sightedness causes even more. Most people not only take an unmerited stay in a heaven or some other comfortable resting place for granted, but behave day after day in this life, as though the welfare state, starting tomorrow, could support one and all to the end of their life on the same luxurious level they have lived on so far. They do not even bear the responsibility for this single life, in its entirety, let alone think about the conditions they themselves are creating for their future incarnations. They try to convince themselves that a welfare state or a loving God will benevolently do for them what they themselves neglect to do. This is fortunately not the case. We people are at liberty to use and apply our intellect and our rationality.
By Johannes Bartschi, Switzerland translation by Rebecca Walkew, Germany Update 2017 by Marianne Uhlinger, Switzerland.